I now declare this 37th meeting of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts in order. Before we turn our mind to the public accounts, which we're here to deal with, colleagues, I just wanted to bring you up to speed. Just a little bit of business. If you recall, there had been certain parameters that the clerk and I were given in terms of scheduling going forward for the next few weeks. Just to advise you that it is coming together. It looks like we're going to be able to get a fair bit of what we hope to get done by the end of this sitting done. And the way it is right now, next week will be actually 2 meetings of report writing. So that gives us a chance to catch our breath and then go into the last sprint. Got a couple of public hearings we're going to try and get in before we rise at the end of the year. So for next week, planning purposes, you'll get copies of the draft reports. If you could be ready to start going through those, that will be our business next week. And the only other thing I want to mention is that our presenters today, Mr. Matthews, had asked if, instead of using his time for his opening remarks, if he could do a bit of a presentation. I thought that was an excellent idea, and I've given him the okay, and we will append his opening remarks so they're still there. They're still part of the record. They can be drawn upon when we're doing our draft report. But I think it helps if we do a bit of a briefing session, particularly since this is public and it gives the public an opportunity to understand more of what we're doing. And, of course, today is Public Accounts Day, the name of the committee. So, important business. And here, representing the Auditor General, is our Assistant Auditor General, Nancy Chang. Nancy, welcome. Good to have you here again. I'll call upon you in a moment to give us your opening remarks and introduce your delegation. Mr. Matthews, you return again. Good to have you back. I'll look to you shortly also for your presentation and recognition of your delegation. And Mr. Leswick, General Director, Economic Fiscal Policy from the Department of Finance. No opening remarks, but apparently you're making yourself available to answer any questions that might come up during our discussions. So, colleagues, that's the lineup. We're ready to go, and unless somebody has an intervention at the last minute, we'll get going. I don't see any. So, with no further ado, Madame Chang, you now have the floor, ma'am.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having given us the opportunity to discuss our audit of the consolidated financial statements of the Government of Canada for 2013-2014. I am accompanied today by Louise Bertrand and Karen Hogan, co-principals responsible for the audit. We thank the committee for taking an interest in the public accounts of Canada. This is an important government accountability report. It is the responsibility of the government to prepare the consolidated financial statements. It is our responsibility to express an opinion on whether these consolidated financial statements are fairly presented. I will focus my comments on our audit opinion and our observations. As you are aware, the public accounts of Canada are tabled in 3 volumes. Our independent auditor's report and our observations are contained in Section 2 of Volume 1. Unless otherwise noted, the information in all other sections of this volume and the 2 other volumes is unaudited. Our independent auditor's report on the 2013-14 consolidated financial statements can be found on page 2.4 in Volume 1 of the Public Accounts. This marks the 16th year that we have expressed an unmodified audit opinion.
The Auditor General Act, we provided an opinion on the government's consistency of application of its accounting policies. Our independent auditor's report signaled a change in the government's accounting policy for premiums and discounts arising from the buyback of bonds. This change has been properly presented and disclosed in Note 2 to the consolidated financial statements. Our observations over the past several years have highlighted concerns about the financial reporting of inventories and asset pooled items at National Defence. Last year, we indicated that National Defence was working on several initiatives to improve its financial reporting capabilities. This year, although some progress has been made, we continued to find errors. Since 2003, we have been reporting concerns about inventories and asset pooled items at National Defence. The Department needs to address several fundamental concerns with the proper recording and valuation of these assets. Strong financial management controls reduce the risk of misstating the consolidated financial statements and making decisions without accurate information. We thank the Comptroller General and his staff, as well as others in the departments that were involved in preparing these accounts. A great deal of work was involved, and we appreciate the cooperation and assistance that was provided to us. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer the committee's questions.
Very good. Thank you very much. And Mr. Matthews, you now have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et bonne...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to the members of this committee. It's our pleasure to be here today and answer questions regarding public accounts for the year ending March 31st, 2014. As you already said, I have a few colleagues with me. I have Mr. Michel Vaillant, Acting Executive Director, Government Accounting Policy and Reporting, as well as Mr. Nick Leswick, General Director representing Finance, General Director, Economic and Fiscal Branch, Finance Canada.
Full to you. 2 main parts to this, and I'll start us on slide 3. Really, I'll give you a quick overview of the results in terms of what we found this year in our financial statements, And then at the back end, I'll spend a little bit of time on the two restatements that we've made adjustments for in this year's public accounts. So that's kind of the main themes. Slide 3, as my colleague from the Auditor General has mentioned, we have an unmodified or clean audit opinion for the 16th year in a row, something that we are very proud of, and all members of the finance community in the Government of Canada should be proud of that fact. I cannot mention the audit opinion without thanking my colleagues from the Auditor General. This is very much a great deal of work and it requires excellent collaboration, and we did have that again this year. Annual deficit, as you are likely aware, was $5.2 billion this year. That represents a decrease of $13.2 billion from what was originally forecasted in Budget 2013. As I go through my remarks in this presentation, you will notice that I will be doing a lot of comparisons between the initial numbers in the budget, which, according to the accounting standards, are what gets compared to our financial statements, as well as to results in the previous year. It's always interesting to see what happened in one year versus the next. The accumulated deficit, which is the difference between our net assets and liabilities, is $611.9 billion, and that is an increase of $2.5 billion. You might be wondering, for those of you who are into these accounting things, how an annual deficit of 5.2 got us to a change in accumulated deficit of 2.5. And the difference is something called other comprehensive income, which in this year's case impacted the accumulated deficit, and it relates to changes in fair market values and things like that, other things related to our pension liability or benefit liabilities, etc. Other thing I should highlight for you is the accumulated deficit to GDP ratio of 32.5%. That's a decrease of 1% from the previous year. And Finance Canada does have a long-term target for this number, and I'm sure my colleague Mr. Leswick will be happy to talk about that if that's of interest to the committee. Slide number 4. This is the high-level financial results. What you'll see here is total revenues are basically up over the previous year, as well as up over what was forecasted in the budget, so 271.7. What I will tell you when you're looking at these comparisons is revenues were up across the boards, personal and corporate, and I will have some more detail on that in a moment. Program expenses, $248.6 billion, slightly up over the previous year, but lower than what was forecasted in the budget by a little bit. And then you've got public debt, which, slight changes there, but largely on track with what was forecasted. Annual deficit, as I've already mentioned, came in at $5.2 billion, which was significantly lower than what was originally forecast in Budget 2013. There is the restatements number of $7 billion on there, and I will give you some additional information on that in a few moments. If I could take you to slide 5, this gives you the breakdown of revenues. As I mentioned, revenues are up across the board. We've shown you here personal, corporate, GST, and other. What I will highlight for you here is personal tax, as I mentioned, is up. It represents about 48% of total revenues. That as a percentage is down slightly from the previous year, but largely a consistent sort of relationship. If you're wondering what's driving the increase in other, that is primarily driven by two things. The government disposed of some shares in General Motors that it realized a gain on, as well as the disposal of an asset. Our embassy in England, our chancellery in London, was sold, and that actually, the gain on sale is in that number as well. EI premiums are there. They represent about 8% of our total revenue. GST and corporate, just to sort of round out the big amounts, corporate tax is 13.5% and GST is about 11.4% of the total revenue mix. But the message on revenues are they're up across the board over the previous year and over what was forecast in the budget. If I could take you to slide 6, what you'll see here is fairly small changes in terms of the expenditure side or expense side of the house. Benefits on the elderly side up over the previous year, but slightly below what we were tracking for in the budget. But this is not a new story. Elderly program benefits increasing because of our aging population. EI benefits largely consistent with the previous year, and children's benefits up very slightly. The only other thing I should mention here is maybe total program expenses. When you look at those numbers, those include the expenses of ministries. There's been some media attention the last couple of days on lapses, which is the amount departments can spend or did spend relative to the amount of spending they were authorized for. happy to take questions on explaining those numbers if that's of interest to committee. Great. The second part of this is the focus on the two restatements. First one is slide 7, and that's the bond buyback. And the background on this one, and I have mentioned the importance of comparing or being able to compare the financial results from one fiscal year to the next, and my colleague from the Auditor General mentioned that part of their opinion is on the consistency of our accounting policies. And when the government buys back debt or buys back bonds, we were basically following an old accounting policy that was essentially no longer relevant. And the history here is when you're doing financial statements, you look to accounting standards set by an independent body. In our case, we look to the public sector accounting standards. When they're silent, you look to other sources. So you would look to the standards of other countries. And we were married to a standard from the U.S. that was no longer in play, basically. So when we looked at that, in effect, when there's a discount or a premium on a bond buyback, if the debt is extinguished, the new accounting standards require you to take that into income or expense immediately, as opposed to amortizing it over a period of time. So we've made that change, and we've done it retroactively as well, so the two years of financial results are in fact comparable. So you see here on the slide the effect of that change. My colleague from the Auditor General has mentioned that they have opined that that was done properly, but I did want to highlight that change for you, as well as one other change I'll speak to, which is on slide 8. This one's an interesting one. It's the valuation allowance for social housing programs. So essentially what we have here is some programs administered by Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, and effectively they were giving loans, and then the recipients of these loans were basically funded to pay them back. So I think we would all agree if that I gave you a loan, and I will oversimplify here to make the point. If I gave you a loan and then gave you money to pay me back, you really haven't paid me back. I'm effectively giving you a gift, not a loan. So when we make those loans, we had factored in a valuation allowance to reflect the fact that really those loans weren't all being paid back. Some were being paid back with government money the government was flowing through appropriations. What we realized is we had not taken into account all of the loans of that nature. So we basically broadened the scope of that allowance to capture all of the loans in question. And again, we have applied that change retroactively to make sure that these statements are consistent. So $1.6 billion increase in the opening balance of accumulated deficits and a $0.2 billion decrease in the annual deficit. So not a huge amount, but I did want to highlight those two changes for you so you were aware of them. Both have been done on a consistent basis from the previous year. Mr. Chair, before I conclude, I think all I will ask is maybe if members have questions that relate to a specific page of the public accounts. The page numbers in English and French are slightly different, so if you can give us a page number, that would help, and then give us a moment to find the equivalent page number dans la version française ou anglaise, depending on the nature of the question, and we would be happy to provide it to all committee members so that they may follow along. With that, we are happy to take your questions.
Very good. Thank you. I think that was wise for you to take the time to do that as opposed to read your statement, as important and informative as that is, too. I also just want to say at the outset, before we begin the rotation, this is the committee that Canadians rely on to keep an eye on the Treasury, both in terms of making sure money that's supposed to come into the Treasury, and then how it's spent and what it's spent on, and the proper procedures from within. And we try to do this as nonpartisan as our DNA will allow us. And so it needs to be said, and I want to say it, that receiving the 16th clean audit in a row, and that takes in more than one party, it says a lot about the way that finances are run in Canada. Not so much the political decisions, we decide that in a different way. But in terms of, and some of us have been to countries where the money is stolen from the people before it even gets to the Treasury, and a clean audit, at the very least, in my view, tells us as Canadians that we're not being ripped off, at least not in the same way that some countries have their treasury taken, siphoned off into a Swiss bank account or somewhere else offshore long before the people even know the money's there, let alone any risk of it being misspent. So I want to, on behalf of all the members of the committee, but in particular all Canadians, thank all those that were involved in once again giving us what we call a clean audit, meaning that at least the macro pieces of the money that this nation has and should have in our treasury is there, and then we can then start dealing with some of the details of how that money is spent and whether it was appropriate or not. But at the very least, it's good to know that that our treasury is not being stolen, ripped off, diverted, that the money that should be there is there. And I just want to say, as in a nonpartisan way, as the chair of the committee, that we're very proud of all those that played a role in giving us that reputation. We're proud of our reputation, and you're the ones that day to day give us that. So thank you all very, very much for any role that anyone has played in giving us that clean audit. That's the good news. Now we'll move on from there. But we will start, first of all, with our first Vice Chair, John Carmichael. Sir, you have the floor now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and articulately stated, if I might add. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And so to that opening comment by the Chair, I'd like to first of all, Mr. Matthews, thank you for the deck. I think that's very helpful, and I think the more that we can do with this type of information for comparative purposes is very helpful to the committee, and I'm sure to those watching it helps everybody to better understand what the work is that we're trying to understand and truly deliver on behalf of all Canadians. So thank you for that. Ms. Cheng, I'd like to begin with you. I'd like to just do a couple of, ask you a few very brief questions with regards to the clean audit. But before I do, I just want to read your economic highlights briefly for the record. And on section 1.3, you comment under the highlights that 5 years after global recession, the global economic environment remains fragile. Despite the challenging external environment, the Canadian economy has been resilient. For instance, Canada has led all other G7 economies in real GDP growth over the recovery. This has translated into one of the strongest job creation performances over the period, with over 1 million more Canadians now working than in July 2009 when the recovery began. Truly, I think, gives us a good standard by which we can launch into the next year. And when we talk about the clean audit and the quality of the work that you and your people are performing, which I applaud, for the 16th consecutive year, the Auditor General's report has issued an unmodified opinion of Canada's, Government of Canada's consolidated financial statements, and something I think that we should all be very proud of. And I wonder, you mentioned it briefly in your comments, your opening comments. Could you just comment, though, on what this means for Canada in terms of a clean audit?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Having 16 years of unmodified and clean audit opinion indeed is an exceptional accomplishment. I did get my staff to take a quick look around other G8 countries just to sort of see what might the situation be with respect to their financial reporting and the status of audit results. Some of them don't even have what we call whole of government accounts. And what that means is that bringing all the ministry information together so you would have an overall portrait of the country as a whole. So for example, Germany and Italy, they don't actually have whole of government accounts. Once you get past that, then you say, well, what is the nature of the audit results and whether they do get the clean opinion? And we have a denial of opinion in the United States from as far back as 2007 up to the current state. So they have many exceptions and qualifications and modifications in terms of saying what might not be fairly presented with respect to the whole set of financial statements, for example. What we saw was that in Australia and New Zealand, for example, they're the ones that do have clean opinion. We went as far back as 2007, and they seem to have consecutive years, but I wouldn't know whether they would actually have a record like Canada to have 16 years of clean opinion. So indeed, it is an an exceptional accomplishment on the part of Canada, and we do have high-quality financial statements. Just one point of clarification, Mr. Chair, if I might. The member referred to page 1.3, Section 1. Section 1 is financial analysis that is prepared by the Government of Canada through Finance Canada. So those are not audit comments, and if members have questions about that or wish to have further deliberation about that, that should come from the Department of Finance. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that for clarity. So when you had your look around at other nations and looking at other audit reports, I wonder if you could share with the committee the requirements needed for a government to, in fact, achieve that clean opinion. I mean, we're talking consolidated statements, so you're bringing in all the various Crown corporations, the various ministries, et cetera, into one consolidated statement. Can you give us an idea of what goes into the work you do in bringing this together?
It is a significant undertaking, Mr. Chair, thank you. It is a significant undertaking on the part of the Office of the Auditor General to conduct a public accounts audit. We have to look at the accounts in terms of the various components that sits within the Government of Canada and have a view about which are the more significant components. This is in the profession what we call a group audit. So skipping over the technicality, essentially we have to decide where the bigger pieces are, the significant components, and where the major risks are, so then we can tailor our audit procedures towards them. So first and foremost, we have to gather knowledge about the entity, which is the overall reporting entity of the Government of Canada, which has many large departments, many significant transactions throughout the year. We have a view about which are the ones that we would actually conduct significant work on, and then from there we need to look at systems of control, look at the weaknesses, and then verify transactions. So it is a significant undertaking, and it is the largest financial audit in the office.
Thank you. Time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Carmichael. And now over to Mr. Allen. You now have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank folks for being with us today. Mr. Chang, I'm going to actually go to Section 2.41, which is the observation of the Auditor General of Canada on the consolidated financial statements, and talks about it's actually in Volume 1, Section 2.41. That's how my book is numbered at the bottom. Yeah. It's actually talking about two different departments, but three different things. And the two are the same department, National Defence. And I know, Ms. Chang, we both know, because we've both been here, it's not the first time National Defence has come up either in the Public Accounts of Canada or in separate chapters of your audits that have been done through the Auditor General. I'm primarily looking at the recommendation for compensating controls and the progress to date. You note in your comments that, and I won't put words in your mouth, it seems as if it is not progressing as well as it might or one would hope. Can you comment to that piece? Specifically the first one of 2.41, because I know there's separate ones there.
Before
physical
my colleague
inventory.
responds, just the page reference dans la version française, c'est 2.43.
The page reference is 2.43 in English, or rather in French.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, national defense has been a subject that we have been observing on for a number of years, as I mentioned in my opening statement. Here, when we talk about the compensating control, it's because the department actually has filed an action plan with the committee, with the Public Accounts Committee, to indicate a number of initiatives that they're going to undertake to improve inventory management. But if we look at that particular action plan, it's going to take us out to 2016. And in the interim, they still hold significant inventory for the Government of Canada. So hence the term compensating control. In the interim, what are you going to do? What are some of the things that can be done to make sure that financial reporting is properly respected so that we can continue to earn and keep our clean opinions? That is important, right? So hence, we identify a number of things. We made a number of suggestions to the department in terms of things that perhaps they could consider doing. And on page, as you pointed out, 2.41 in English et 2.43 en français, we identify several steps that perhaps the department can consider. In terms of that first step, the physical inventory count, we did observe some progress. So the department is moving in the right direction. What they've been trying to do is to improve their inventory count. They haven't quite got it to the point that we can derive sufficient assurance from it to rely on it for the existence and conditions of the inventory, but they're moving in the direction. And that will be a long journey because ultimately it may not be achievable to try to count everything that National Defense has on March 31st, from coast to coast and everything. So there is that practicality that kicks in as well. But certainly we feel that there's more they could have done in that area. With respect to some of the other suggestions, they're not as taxing in some ways. Sometimes what we observe on are, for example, pricing differences. So we observe lack of awareness of how to capture some of the information. One of the difference that we saw is on the extreme side, if you will, is the pricing for some washers. Instead of putting down the unit price, which is less than $1 a piece, they put in the price from the box, which is like $70,000. So all of a sudden, you've inflated your inventory value significantly, right? So those are some of the things that maybe it's training, maybe it's awareness. The other thing is that there isn't necessarily a culture there to try to examine what's the cause of these problems. When we have a difference, what's causing it? Trying to see if that can be rectified as they move forward, or whether there are similar items that might be subject to this kind of error condition. Because what we did was a sample. And a sample is really just pulling a number of items and amongst a mass of inventory items that D&D might have. So a lot of these are being shared with the department. There will be a more detailed management letter from the component audit team to help National Defense to understand some of our points, to try to work with them and to encourage them to make improvements. But certainly there is still a lot that needs to be done before we can claim success on this one.
Just a couple of seconds, so you're de facto done. Sorry. You're welcome. We'll move along now to Mr. Hayes. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question will be directed to Mr. Leswick, and it's specific to a statement made actually in the very first paragraph. It states that Canada has the strongest real business investment performance in the G7 over the recession and subsequent recovery. And I guess my question is, how do you determine that? What are the factors that enable you to actually state definitively that Canada is in that position? And part two of the question is, in your opinion, are there government policies that we put in place that would contribute to Canada having the strongest real business investment performance in the G7?
Thank you for the question. So I think the first part is just the pure metrics of it. So business investment is part of the larger composition of the national accounts. And the national accounts are a metric that's used globally. So this is an OECD, United Nations standards in terms of how we effectively quantify economic activity and specifically economic growth, the composition of the economy across the world. So business investment fits within the private demand, so domestic demand within an economy, business investment, residential investment, investment in inventories, and also consumption. So that's the basket of domestic private sector activity that forms part of the national accounts. So clearly business investment is a tranche within that. And that's investment in machinery and equipment and capital structures. So I hope that's clear. That's part one, just in terms of the metrics. Part two, what has the government done to effectively lead to the statistic around more robust business investment? Well, I'd say a couple of things. Tax incentives. We have the lowest marginal effective tax rate on new business investment in the G7. So amongst large advanced economies, we have the lowest investment on lowest tax rate on new business investment. Obviously, it goes without saying that incentivizes new business investment. Likewise, other types of tax incentives, such as the accelerated capital cost allowance over the last couple of years, have further boosted the incentive to invest in machinery and equipment and capital structures.
Now, you also go on to reference global growth, and that weak growth in the external demand for Canadian products has reduced incentive for Canadian business to increase capacity. And would you say that these external factors are beyond the control of the Government of Canada?
I mean, quite simply stated, yes. I mean, we obviously consult with private sector economists and the banks and the think tanks. We work very closely with the IMF and the OECD. And I mean, the IMF tabled their most recent World Economic Outlook, and for 7 of the last 8 outlooks, they've revised down their global economic growth projections. You know, this uncertainty is coming from Europe, to some extent south of the border in the United States, just in terms of how they regularize their monetary policy and rectify their fiscal situation. And then even further, obviously, China isn't growing at the 10% clip that it was. It's growing in a more normal Chinese terms, 7% rate. So these types of external factors are playing in and weighing on Canadian domestic growth. So specifically, our export potential, who's buying Canadian goods, Canadian terms of trade, who's buying Canadian energy products, and likewise, companies are effectively sitting on cash because they're afraid to make new investments without more robust global demand.
So when a government gets criticized because the country has a trade deficit, what I'm hearing from you is the trade deficit is no fault of the government. It is reflective of what's happening in the global economy.
Well, I mean, trade deficit's composed of a lot of things, trade in services, trade in goods. As you know, the dynamics across service and goods industries are so different and, in a pan-Canadian context. But, yeah, it's external demand is probably the greatest risk to the Canadian economy at the moment.
Thank you. I'm guessing I'm close.
No, I give it a half a minute if you want.
Half a minute, okay. I want to just pick up quickly on page 1.8. Reference is made to interest ratio, and this ratio has been in a steady decline and has reached 10.4% in 2013-2014. I just want to get a sense of what contributes to that decline, and what does that mean to Canadians? I look at 10.4% and I'm saying, okay, so what? What if it was 20% or what if it was 5%? What is the significance of the 10.4% to Canadians?
You go ahead.
Maybe I'll just start and I'll let my colleague from Finance finish. That's been a steady decline, and if you think about the public debt charges, if I recall correctly, if you go back to 96, 97, our expenses on public debt were eating up about 30% of our expenses. So if you think about that, leaves 70% for government programs, just grosso modo. So when you can drive down the interest number as a percentage, it basically allows additional, a higher percentage of your spending to be on program spending rather than paying down the debt. The percentage you're dealing with on interest, and here's where my colleague Mr. Leswick can clarify and add additional stuff, is 2 things. One, it's the size of your debt, and secondly, at play is the size of your economy. So, debt over the last couple of years has been going up because of the recession. We had the Economic Action Plan, et cetera, but that came on the heels of a number of years when the government was running a surplus. So, there was reductions in debt. Interest rates are lower. That certainly helps. And, since the 96, 97 year, economy has certainly grown as well. And Nick, you may want to clarify or add. No, you're good.
Okay, that's great. And we're well over time anyway, so we should move along. Over to Monsieur Giguère. You have the floor, sir.
Monsieur le Président, ça fait...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's always a pleasure to work together to improve financial statements instead of constantly trying to correct the deficit situations. My first question is found at page 1.3 when you talk about economic highlights. The problem I have with that is we are being told about quantitative documents, but these past few years we've seen documents, we've seen articles from American universities who have been delivering qualitative analysis. We've been talking about 1 million jobs, but that have been created after the recession. But we seem to easily forget the 650,000 jobs that we lost during the recession, which means that from 2007 to now, that's 450,000 jobs that we've gained. But the problem is that the Canada Revenue Agency, when it compares the average income of taxpayers from 2008 to today, it has observed a major drop, which means that for the same amount of work, people have been making less. We have lost 300,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector, major jobs. Why is there no qualitative analysis of economic highlights on this page in order to know how to better improve the situation, create better jobs, better paying jobs, full-time job, instead of what we're seeing now, a bunch of poorly paid part-time jobs?
I guess for the first part of the question, indeed, the Canadian economy has recovered all jobs lost and more since the jobs that it shed during the recession. It partners with the United States in kind of trumpeting that dynamic. In terms of why don't the economic highlights provide more qualitative commentary in terms of income, so the quality of pay of jobs, and I think what you mean is income distribution across all the income quintiles within the Canadian population, and also job type. It's not the place that we do it in the front end of the public accounts. We did produce the jobs report as an appendix to the last year's federal budget, and which provided a more robust and fulsome, comprehensive commentary on the job situation here in Canada. I don't know if I wanted to go any further, really, but.
Is that satisfactory? Do you want to jump in?
The problem is we compare the unemployment rate, we accompany it with the activity rate, which allows us to see really if there's been a growth in jobs or if there's been people who have been leaving the labor market because they have grown tired for looking for jobs that never show up. That's what we usually do. You accompany an analysis of the unemployment rate with the activity rate. And we compare the job growth rate with the growth rate in the population, the general population. We were told that there was a 6.4% increase in jobs since 2009, but the population increase has been of 6.6%. So if you look at labor participation rates, in the United States it's 62%, and in Canada it's 64%. These are generally numbers that allow us to get a better view of job growth rates. And you were telling me that we've made back all the jobs that we lost during the recession and more. That's great. But if we compare the jobs that we lost with the jobs that we've gained, it still gives you a 400,000 jobs spread over 6 years. That's not a great number per year if you compare with the situation that existed before the recession.
In terms of labor force participation rates, I mean, again, we boast the highest participation rates in the G7. We're above our U.S. counterparts. In terms of the long-term unemployment rate, again, we have less long-term unemployed. As the economic highlights suggest, we have the best job creation record since 2006. Again, not presented in the public accounts, I absolutely acknowledged, but in terms of the information we provided in the budget, the jobs report, and the economic and fiscal updates, I think we stay pretty current in the state of the Canadian labor force and provide those statistics on a regular basis.
Okay, sorry, time has expired. Moving along, Mr. Falk, you now have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on Mr. Giguère's observations a little bit, when I look at the EI premiums on slide 5 of your presentation, Mr. Matthews, I see that there were more EI premiums remitted this past year than the year prior, which tells me that there's increased employment. EI premiums only go up when there's more people paying premiums because the rates didn't change. So I'm seeing an increased employment there from the numbers that I see. But I'd like to direct most of my comments to table number found on page 1.9, and I'd like to ask a few questions about transfer payments. Can you explain just what the major transfer payments to persons are?
Thank you for the question, and I'm just going to turn to my colleague to give me the page number en français. C'est la même chose ou non?
Page 1.9 English.
1.9 English?
It's page 6 of your slide.
And 1.10 en français, merci. So this is the transfer payments section, and if you actually look at the public accounts, we list the main elements on page 1.9. So you start with elderly benefits, so that is your guaranteed income supplement and your old age security. And as we've discussed, those numbers are going up because of increasing population in terms of our elderly population. Those benefits are also subject to indexing for CPI, so that will also drive increases there. EI benefits is a function, as we've discussed before, depending on the unemployment rate, so that's the EI benefits that have flown out. And then children's benefit is the universal child tax credit, and one other one in there that I'm drawing a blank on. Yes, so thank you.
Sorry, what was that?
The universal child care benefit?
Yes, universal child care benefit. Okay.
So those are the major components there. And then that makes up a fairly significant portion of our total spending, as you can see. What I will say about the transfers to persons, especially the GIC OIS, from a government planning perspective, those are statutory in nature. So if you went to the estimates, you wouldn't see them actually voted on. Those are statutory obligations. So that's just for your reference as well.
Okay, and I'm just looking here at that chart further, and I see that transfer payments to other levels of governments.
Right.
What would that all be comprised of? I see they've all gone up.
The big two there are the Canada Health Transfer and the Social Transfer, and those were, I believe, legislated increases in the past year. So those are the two big numbers driving those. You've got other ones as well, but those are the two main ones I would highlight for you. And Nick, if you want to add, feel free to. But
nope,
you're good. All right.
Okay, and then other transfer payments. Can you expand a little bit what would be included in that?
The other would be things like, they're kind of one-off. What is in here, if I recall correctly, is the transfer to the province of Alberta related to the flood relief is in other transfers. So that's kind of, it's not a regular program. That's a one-off you would see. That is kind of driving the change there.
Okay, and I mean, that number has increased from 34 billion to 36 billion.
And that's why you see the increases. That's, if I'm remembering correctly, the Alberta flood relief is in that number.
Okay. And what other types of things would be in there?
And it's 2.2 billion. The other, in terms of what else is in that 34, maybe if you can give me a minute, we can answer your question, but we'll come back to that one. And if you wanted to keep going down that list, you've got other program expenses for Crown corporations and departments and agencies. So the Crown corporations, you'll see, has dropped from 2012-13. You've got 7.4 in 13-14 versus 9.5 in 12-13. The reason for that drop is the previous year was a bit of an anomaly in that we had a large increase because of atomic energy. So that has returned to a more normal situation. They took a bit of a bump because of an increase in the liability related to the cleanup. And then other ministries, that's just our regular departments and agencies in terms of their operating expenses. And if you want to go back to the other transfers, yes, please do.
Well, just to put some meat on the bone on other transfers, and I think this is your question. So this is the suite of grants and contributions delivered by departments. So anything from Aboriginal programming, other infrastructure programming, labor market programming in an employment and social development context, which amount to 36
billion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So in the estimates where you see the grants and contribution elements,
okay,
that would be that.
So would it be fair then to assume that the table, when I look at the table, is telling us that year over year the government has actually reduced the cost of operating government and has increased the transfer payments both to individual persons as well as to other government bodies?
Well, thank you for the question. You'll recall when the government put in place the Economic Action Plan, which resulted in growth in spending. On the heels of that, as that was wound down, the government went through some reductions. Certain categories of spending were off limits in terms of reductions, including transfers to individuals. And transfers to our provinces were held harmless as well. There was a focus on reducing the operating costs of government as well as other areas, so you are seeing that take place now. So program spending is certainly dropping down, as you have mentioned.
Thank you. We're good for time. Okay. Thanks very much. We'll move along now, although not a regular member of the committee, certainly a veteran and a distinguished one at that. Mr. Regan, good to have you. Regan, good to have you here. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those kind words and for allowing me the floor. Ms. Cheng, I'd like to, of course, refer you to on pages 1.45 to 149 of Volume 2 in the summary tables. You've outlined the $7.4 billion in lapsed spending from various government departments. I'd like to like Mr. Allen, I'd like to focus on one of them, which is for the moment, which is national defense. Obviously, military procurement is something that's particularly important that a government do it well. It provides our men and women in uniform with important equipment and makes them safer, obviously, and allows them to do their jobs. It can help create jobs and spur research in Canada. And yet this government has talked a lot more about procurement and equipment than it's actually delivered, especially when you think about the ships they've been talking about lately. In 2006, the Prime Minister promised 3 Arctic icebreakers to be in service by the end of 2014. That would be this year. That promise, of course, became 1 icebreaker by 2022 and 6 to 8 smaller Arctic offshore patrol vessels. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Officer actually is telling us that with the current budget, the government can only afford 4 Arctic offshore patrol ships and only 3 if they delay another year. So in a case like this where we're seeing $1 billion lapsed from the defense budget, and we're seeing this pushing off of these expenditures and apparently reduction in what we're going to get for those expenditures, what does that mean in terms of a greater expense to the taxpayer in terms of value for money?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question does not really pertain on the financial reporting. Essentially, if the department overspend its appropriation, then there is disclosure in the notes, and according to Note 2 or Note 3, there isn't any this particular year. So the focus of the audit would not lead us to look at lapsing of funds at national defense. That would not be part of the scope of a public accounts audit, but rather maybe one of a question of financial management and control at national defense should we undertake a performance audit.
Looks as though Mr. Matthews wants to comment.
I can comment on the lapse in general, and then I will get back to your specific question. So the lapse in general is not well understood. I do want to make one very important point. When Parliament authorizes spending, it's an up to amount. It's not you must spend 100, it's an up to. So it's a maximum. It is against the law to overspend. So some degree of lapsing is actually expected, because if departments are right up to the penny, they're risking of going over. So we do expect some degree of lapsing. When you look at the lapsing, it's down this year over the previous year in terms of a whole of government basis. And what we like to look at is whether the lapse was planned or unplanned. So if you go back years ago, we do vote money year by year. If you didn't spend it, it evaporated and you had to sort of reapply for it. Departments are allowed to carry forward 5% of their unspent operating into the next year. They're allowed to carry forward 20% of their capital spending unspent into the next year. So that allows departments to, it's not lost money. So in the case of national defense, they're actually not, that money isn't going away. It will be back in their reference levels, but Parliament does vote money year by year. But you raised an interesting point on the shipbuilding. What you'll see for projects that are long-term in nature and complicated, there's often delays, as you have mentioned. The prices and the costs of those projects are often, in the case of shipbuilding, at the mercy of prices of steel. So if you delay 5 years, 10 years, whatever, at the end of the day you actually get less steel for your money than you did when the project was first conceived. So when these projects are managed, there's really 2 ways to do it. You can set aside money for the department to build a certain number of ships, or if you know it's a long-term complex project, you can set aside a certain amount of money and say to the department, you need to live within that envelope, and you figure out how many ships you're going to get. And that, I think, I can't speak to the Parliamentary Budget Officer's methodology, but there is an erosion of dollars over time because of inflation as the projects are delayed. Complex projects like shipbuilding, it's quite normal that they will kind of slide a bit from their initial focus. But to your comment on defense, that money that they lapsed is all within their carry-forward limits or reprofiled. They're not going to lose that money.
But it sounds as if you're telling me that there's no reason to believe that we're going to receive the number of ships the government's been talking about.
I can't speak to the plans on the shipbuilding and where the Parliamentary Budget Officer's analysis is based on. there has been delays, and it's, as I've said, as time goes on, you do lose inflation dollars on things like steel.
This spring, you were looking at both public sector pension plans and also the question of aggressive tax planning. And now we have news yesterday from CBC that, in fact, Germany has accused Canada's federal public sector pension board of being involved in aggressive tax planning. What are your thoughts on this when we have our public sector pension board engaging in this, the kind of aggressive tax planning that the federal government seeks to avoid and discourages and, in fact, says it's cracking down on? And what kind of example is this setting to Canadians?
So a couple of comments on the pension plan in general. The liabilities for the government's pension plan are included in the financial statements, and you'll see those there. The pension plan produces its own financial statements. The organization in question here is a Crown Corporation. It's the Public Service Sector Investment Planning Board. It's a Crown Corporation. It's arm's length from government. It is managed by a board of directors. I haven't yet heard their response to the allegations, but really it's up to them to respond to those. They are arm's length from government for a reason. They do the investments, and that story, I believe, just broke this morning or last night, and we'll see what they have to say. But they are arm's length from the core government.
Not here. Done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Time's expired. Thank you very much. Moving now over to Mr. Woodworth, who now has the floor. Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My thanks to the witnesses. It's always fascinating information to delve into, and I appreciate your expertise all around. I'd like to ask some questions of Mr. Leswick, and I'll begin with the chart on page 1.20 of the English version, which I'll just summarize as saying that it reviews the net government debt percentage to GDP of the G7 nations, including Canada, and points out that the OECD estimates that the average percentage of debt to GDP for those G7 nations is 84.3%. And I understand that the Canadian government has managed the lowest total government net debt to GDP at around 40.3%. So I'd like to ask Mr. Leswick, how did the government manage that? What factors contributed to what I would consider to be a successful result?
Perfect. Thank you for the question. So just in terms of describing the statistic we're looking at, numerator, denominator, so this is net debt on a total government basis. So this includes national accounts data across provinces and the federal government. It also includes the assets of the QPP and the CPP in order for it to be comparable on an international basis, just because not every federalism is designed like Canada's. There's different levels of sovereign and sub-sovereign responsibilities, so we accumulate all the debts of the provinces and the federal government together to be consistent. And then, obviously, on the denominator, this is just over GDP, so this reflects the size of our economy. How did the government get there? I mean, responsible fiscal management. We've, maintained an eye on our debt dynamics so that our debt burden does not overwhelm the size of our economy. It's been going down recently. Obviously, from a federal government perspective, we've gone from peaks of close to 70% debt GDP ratios in the mid-90s to now something closer in the order of 30% from a federal perspective. So when you bring that into the total government perspective, you see how we contribute to the all of Canada picture. That's a pretty fair, well, that is an accurate representation of where we're at.
Of the people who are of the provinces and agencies that make up that average percentage, are there any that do better than the Government of Canada's 30% that you just mentioned? If you know. If you don't, perhaps I'm going beyond your jurisdiction.
I do know. They're in this. Those numbers are somewhere in this binder, but I don't have them at my fingertips.
Maybe we could take a rain check and get that
absolutely,
later.
absolutely.
I do have a few other questions I want to try to get to. So the next one relates to a graph on page 1.5, I hope, of the English version here, and it's the revenue ratio, the revenues as a percentage of GDP. And what I understand from that is that our current ratio of revenue to GDP is down significantly from the 1996 to 2001 period, and yet our actual revenues are still greater. So could you explain how it is the government is taking in more money even though there has been a reduction in the revenue to GDP ratio, at least since that earlier period that I mentioned?
Again, thank you for the question. Obviously, it is just the mathematics of it. So numerator by denominator. So while the numerator is just the nominal level of effectively our tax collection, and that can go up. The fact is that our economy is growing faster than that trajectory, so that the overall metric is decreasing. So while we continue to collect more tax revenues because our economy is growing, we collect more income taxes, consumption taxes in the form of the GST, corporate taxes, even though we had the corporate rate reduction. The fact is our economy is growing faster than that pace of tax collection. So we use this metric as often a touchstone to reflect the total tax burden on the Canadian economy.
So could I rephrase that and tell me if I'm correct that the increase in taxes has been kept more restrained and more modest than the growth in GDP? Would that be a fair restatement?
I would agree with that.
Okay.
Sorry, time has expired, sir. And now over to Monsieur Giguère. You have the floor again, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 1.26, and this is the assets and liabilities table. Regarding the pension plans, this is the debt before year 2000, because after 2000 there was formal capitalization of our pension plans. Now, the Supreme Court rendered a decision in which it indicated that no matter the pension plan, the federal government had the responsibility to pay up. And following what happened in Europe, the European Council decided that all public service debt had to show up in financial statements. Would it not be relevant to your presentation to indicate what the debt levels were before 2000 and also what the debt levels were post-2000, even if you have to add certain assets to those funds that have been capitalized, which would allow us to know where we really are and if there is an actuarial deficit in one of the two plans. Wouldn't it be a nice addition to your presentation that would follow along the international recommendations, meaning to indicate what the debt levels are for pension plans currently?
Thoughts. The table, which is in the English version, is page 1.24 if you're trying to follow along, presents a 10-year history. So that's the reason we stop at 2005 in this case. We give a 10-year history, which is a nice comparator. The importance of the year 2000, which the member has mentioned, is that is the point when the government decided to fund part of its pension plan. So pre-2000, the government used to track on its books the pension obligation, but there was no separate fund to actually asset to match the liability like you would have in the private sector. From 2000 on, the government has decided to fund that liability, and that is why the investment board that we were talking about earlier was created, was to manage those investments. When you look at the financial and the Supreme Court decision that was mentioned, I should close the loop on that. There was a surplus in the government's bookkeeping account pre-2000, and there was a court challenge launched by the unions about who should have access to that. It was, in effect, a bookkeeping account, but it was a surplus. And the government had basically used it against the bottom line or general revenues. The Supreme Court concluded that the Government of Canada was the risk holder, and therefore, if the pension was in deficit, it had the risk. If it's in surplus, that's the government's money. So there was no, the court challenge was denied, and there was no money required to go back to the unions. If you look at the government's financial statements, we have substantial disclosure around the pension plans, both funded and unfunded. I would actually tell you, from my own perspective, it's too much. It's an awful lot to get through. So if I could take you to the notes in the pension plans, which start on note 7, and I will try and find a page number for you. The note 7, which is in page 220 in the English version, and 221 in the version, dans la version française, merci beaucoup, that will go...
And then the 220 in the English version?
So you get a description of both. There's different discount rates in play. That's disclosed. The other thing you will see here for your information on page 225, which I think is likely 226 en français, is a sensitivity analysis. And you will not see this, this type of analysis in all pension plans if you compare us to our other countries. So assumptions like the discount rates, both for funded and unfunded, if you get a 1% change in the discount rate up or down, we disclose what that does to our liability. If you get a 1% change up or down in the inflation rate, you see what it does to the liability. Same with wages. So all the major assumptions that affect the pension plan, whether it's funded or unfunded, we also have this disclosure here. If I can go further, there's a whole additional section later on in Volume 1 with additional information on the pension. So
c'est pas l'information que je veux, moi.
It's not the information that I want. I am saying that there was a decision rendered by the Supreme Court saying that the federal government is responsible not only for the actuarial deficits before 2000, but also following 2000. And there are international standards that state that all of the debts vis-a-vis your pension plans should show up in the financial statements. That's what happened in Greece, and they discovered a terrible deficit when they finally opened up those books. So I don't see those international conventions and that Supreme Court decision showing up anywhere on that table at 1.25, 26. It might be interesting to add it, that's all I'm saying. And also, I'd like to say that when you add liabilities post-2000, you also have to add some assets. So in terms of net debt, one would hope there wasn't a change. But if there is a change, well, we'd see where it came from, and that we'd have to take the necessary measures to correct the situation. What I'm asking you is it possible in upcoming years for you to integrate that international standard and that Supreme Court decision in this table so that the liabilities be better subdivided, and that the assets take into account the pension plans that have been funded? It's an interesting question. Well, I know that we follow accounting principles established in Canada by the Canadian Public Sector Standards Board.
Recognition of liabilities for all pension plans. That doesn't fit our accounting standard model. I do appreciate there's an international norm out there. That sort of thinking has not found its way into Canadian accounting standards. If it ever does, we would certainly have to follow it, or we would be in trouble from our friends here to our left. But I would be surprised if any Canadian accounting standard would say the government is responsible for all pension deficits. For the government's own pension plans, absolutely, but I'm not aware of any kind of discussion that would take us down that track. I'm not sure if you are either. But so.
Okay, time has expired. Thank you. Over now to Mr. Albus, and you now have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your presence today. I'm going to start with Mr. Leswick. I believe page 1.6 discusses a little bit about the EI employment insurance regime. If you could just give me just a brief outline of where we're at in the public accounts of this year, and maybe where we were the previous year as far as the EI fund.
Yeah. Yep. When you say where we're at,
yes, where pardon me, not today, but as the public accounts closed out March 31st of this year,
Right.
if you could just kind of give us an idea, it does show that there's some, the revenues increased by $1.4 billion. Where's the fund at? Is it in surplus? Is it in deficit? Just so the people at home, I know many people rely on this program and would certainly like an update on that.
Okay, if you just allow me a moment, that'd be very helpful.
Sure. No.
Thank you for the question, and just to provide obviously some background, the composition of the employment insurance account driven by revenues collected from EI premiums. Those revenues are driven by total employment in the Canadian economy and also insurable earnings. So as insurable earnings go up, people will pay more based on the EI premium rate. More people are working. Obviously, there'll be more revenues flowing into the employment insurance account. And then also the actual EI premium rate setting. So in the current setting, which is $1.88. Then there's EI benefits. So this is the entire suite of employment insurance benefits, from regular benefits, sickness benefits, and then special benefits like maternity benefits and fishing benefits, for example, plus any administration costs from Employment and Social Development Canada and Canadian Revenue Agency are the two biggest players in that. In terms of the EI operating account balance, our most recent projection was in Budget 2014, where we projected the cumulative balance in a deficit position for 2014-15 of approximately $1.5 billion, leading to successive surpluses in future years. So gradually going to a surplus position, as the economy strengthened, and well, I'll leave it at that.
Sure. No, and again, it says EI premiums revenues increased by $1.4 billion, and you made the connection that obviously if you have higher revenues, that's because there's more people working. Is that the case?
In part, it's a factor of those three things I mentioned: employment, how much people are making, so insurable earnings. Likewise, the premium rate setting itself. So between those three factors was what drives the revenues.
Great. And the next question.
Sorry, could I just interject one thing, if you don't mind? If you're interested in Section 4 of Volume 1, the EI account does actually have its own financial statements. So if you want to follow up on those and actually track, against projections, they get their own audit opinions, so they are in Section 4 of Volume 1.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And actually, this might go to either yourself, Mr. Matthews, or Mr. Leswick. I'm obviously Okanagan Coquihalla. We have a lot of people that retire to British Columbia. It's a wonderful place to be. I've had a lot of people ask questions about elderly benefits, and obviously the changes in demographics, make me always ask these kinds of questions. So, I understand there was an increase year over year in actual dedicated funding for elderly benefits. Could someone just give a little bit more detail as to what the increases were, as well as why the rationale behind that?
I'll start, and if others want to chime in, please do. But the important thing about the elderly benefits is their statutory votes. So they're actually protected in legislation, as opposed to being voted on by Parliament each year. The benefits themselves are a function of the number of recipients who are of the appropriate age and the payment that they receive on a biweekly basis. Those benefits are fully indexed to the Consumer Price Index, so they will go up based on the Consumer Price Index. The only thing I should add to that in terms of forecasting, they did go up. They didn't go up quite as much as we had forecasted, simply because the inflation, because the CPI was lower than anticipated. So when we actually did the math, it worked out to be a little less than anticipated, but they are fully indexed to the Consumer Price Index, and that's why they're protected, and that's what basically drives the increase. And those numbers will continue to go up based on our population trends.
Okay. Sorry, time has expired. Okay. Thank you. Moving over and back again to Mr. Regan. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Chairman, as you noted earlier, I'm not a regular member of this committee. I'm normally a member of the Natural Resources Committee, and I don't want to offend the analysts at that committee, who are excellent, by the way, when I say that how impressed I was with the quality of the research material provided by the analysts at this committee, and I want to thank them for that.
pride in the work that they do, and quite frankly, without them, we couldn't do our work. So that's well noted and supported by this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me then return to the question about tax avoidance that I was asking earlier. Mr. Matthews, you mentioned, of course, that the board, the pension board, is arm's length from government. But of course, in the budget this year, the government talked about correcting this problem of tax avoidance. And so I guess the question is what the board's doing really in the spirit of what the government, in particular CRA, is trying to achieve?
The CRA's focus, and you're quite right, was a focus in budget, was a strong stance against international tax evasion. And if I recall correctly, Economic Action Plan 2013, which was the budget, focused on three things. One was offshore tax information program. They strengthened reporting requirements around international electronic funds transfers. And the third bit was expanded reporting for taxpayers with foreign income. What's interesting to note on that front is, and I'm speculating here, in terms of our income tax receipts from foreign recipients, there was a bit of a spike this year. It's not a huge number in terms of the overall global revenue, but it was up by about 23%. I'm speculating it has to do with those measures, but I don't know that for a fact, but there was an increase. In terms of consistency, your question, is what the board is doing, is it consistent with what CRA is doing? We'll have to wait and see what the board's response is. This is a media story. I'm not aware of any charges of wrongdoing, but they are arm's length from government, so I suspect they will come out with a statement fairly soon. I would assume they would be respecting the international tax laws. It would seem very odd if they weren't, but I'm not part of that board, and they're not part of government, so we'll let them respond.
Okay. As all of you will know, of course, last winter, the winter of 2013-14, was a very tough one in eastern Canada, particularly Atlantic Canada, and we had a situation, for example, where icebreakers and crew, the icebreakers run by the Coast Guard, were stretched to the limit. And we had ferries and other ships that were stuck because they couldn't be moved. And now we see that, in fact, that there was a lapse, and yet I have a memorandum from the Atlantic Regional Director of the Coast Guard to all the Atlantic Region Fleet commanding officers outlining the fact that funds were running out, and that they could not afford to bring on additional employees to assist with the demanding winter that they were experiencing. And yet there was a lapse. This department lapsed $172 million that it didn't spend. So I'm at a loss to understand, and I've had some past familiarity with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and enjoyed my time there, but I'm at a loss to comprehend how you can run out of money on the one hand and then lapse money on the other hand.
A couple of comments when you're looking at the lapses. One, Parliament votes money in three different votes, and it's an antiquated system, but operating, capital, grants, and contributions. If I recall correctly, the lapse at Fisheries and Oceans was around capital. They had delays in projects, and so the money is basically sliding and is reprofiled. When you're looking at, and I haven't seen this memo, so I'm speculating here, Mr. Chair, when you're looking at bringing on additional staff, that's operating dollars. And so we hold departments to account. They cannot exceed any one of those votes. If they want to move money between a capital vote and an operating vote, they've got to come to Parliament. So it's not a global total. You can't just say the Department of Fisheries lapsed X. You have to understand what was the lapse. And if I recall correctly, their operating lapse was fairly small. Wasn't big. I think the lapse is capital.
$172 million.
Is it operating or capital?
I'm sorry, I have it in front of me. It's $132 million in lapsed funding. But the point is that the memo was dated January the 14th, 2014, right? Leaving the government 2.5 months before the fiscal year end in order to make the adjustment. And Parliament sat during that period, obviously. It could have dealt with this. Instead, $172 million was lapsed, and during that winter, you had ships that were tied up and couldn't move. So it seems to me, I'd be interested to hear from the Department of the Auditor General whether that is that value for money? Is that considered proper management?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The nature of the questions that get posed to us are really not falling within the scope of the audit of the public accounts. In fact, I should use this opportunity to once again clarify our audit work is straightly on the consolidated financial statements, and that's only in Section 2 of Volume 1. Many of the questions of interest to members are in Section 1, which are primarily the government's own explanation as to what's happening with respect to its finances and the financial performance of the government over the fiscal year. The members now posing questions in Volume 2, and in fact we would not have touched any of the tables or data that is in Volume 2. So we would be looking at these numbers for the first time like yourself when you're referring to them. We know where to find them, we can find the numbers, but again it's not based on audit work, and I would be very reluctant to speak to them. We, as you know, do performance audits, and from time to time we'll be selecting some of these subjects, and that gives us a much more in-depth opportunity to study the issue and then be able to come back with reports. So I think we will note your interest, Mr. Chair, in terms of what the members are asking, but at this point it wouldn't be right for me to try to speculate and provide a response.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
very
very much.
good. Thank you. Time has expired. Moving along, back over to Mr. Hayes. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will stick to public accounts questions. The member honourable has, I think, strayed considerably from public accounts, and we will recall in public accounts we actually discussed the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. And in his statement, he mentioned tax evasion, and none of us know whether there's been tax evasion or not. And I do look forward to studying our chapter on aggressive tax planning, and I'm sure we'll give the members some more feedback after we study that chapter. That being said, I do want to pick back up a little bit just to get some clarity in terms of EI, and I understand, Mr. Matthews, there's a section specific to EI, and I'm not looking at that right now. This is just a general statement. It's an observation that we paid out $17.3 billion in EI benefits yet, as an expense, yet we generated revenues that were $21.7 billion. And I think, Mr. Leswick, you had mentioned that the balance of the account is still in a deficit position. So is it fair to state that the surplus that occurred in EI this year would be used or would go to the balance sheet to offset that particular deficit, resulting in we're still in a liability, but not as much of a liability as we were? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Very good.
We accumulated significant.
Now, I don't know. Oh, Ms. Cheng, you want to comment as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you go back to Volume 1, go to page 4.19. Volume 1.
Hey?
4.19. 4.19.
Okay.
This is where you set the this is where you see the complete set of the statements on the EI operating account.
Yes.
You actually have a fair bit of information there, Mr. Chair. So if you look at 2014 actual, you see your revenues in terms of premium, penalty, interest. You see the expenses in terms of payouts, whether it was a support measure, whether it was other labor market payments. And then you see the funding from Canada. You see a line that says net surplus for the year.
Yes.
It would appear that there was a surplus of $3.2 billion, which was offset against the balance from last year, and now the new balance is a smaller deficit of 2.7. This also speaks to the point that our colleague from Finance Canada spoke about, which is a budgetary projection that there would be a surplus this year, and in fact your actual surplus exceeded the budgeted surplus. So
Great.
Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does help. Thank you very much. And now, again, for Mr. Matthews or Mr. Leswick, I'm really not sure. I want to talk a little bit about expenses as opposed to revenues. And I want to get an understanding of, it's the English page 110 and 111. And we have two charts, one on page 110, which says comparison of 2013-14 outcomes to February 2014 budget. And then on 111, it's a comparison of 2013-14 outcomes to March 2013 budget. Why are we looking at two comparisons, and from which comparison should I be looking at? I find it confusing that we have two reference points there.
It's amazing. Mr. Leswick and I were discussing this by email last night. So our financial statements are driven by externally set accounting standards, and it's important to compare results against budget. That just makes them meaningful. The way the accounting standards are written, basically the comparator is the initial budget. So for the year 2013-14, which ended March 31st, 2014, the first budget was budget 2013. That's where we first set out the plan for that year. Budget 2013, I don't remember the exact date, but it was probably February of 2013. A lot happens between that and the year in question. So things like the changes we made to the retiree health care plan, pension plan changes, the Alberta floods, which I'd mentioned earlier. So what finance will do is, they have things like the economic fall update, and then they also have the budget 2014. So any chance they have to update the economic forecast before the financial results, they'll take that opportunity to say, here's our updated forecast. So in the analysis here, they quite rightly compare it to budget 2013, which is our starting point. But when they did budget 2014, they came along and said some things had changed, and we factored those into our forecast, and that's why you get both reference points. So I think, and Mr. Leswick can add to this, initially in budget 2013, finance always has an amount they set aside for risk. Just in, I think it was $3 billion in budget 2013. I think by the time budget 2014 came along, that amount had been reduced because things were on the upswing. Things were looking better. So they make those types of changes. I'm not sure if you want to add to that, Nick? Or that's...
Yeah, that's fair. We set out an adjustment for risk based on potential risks to the economy in the order of magnitude of $20 billion on nominal GDP. And then as the year progresses, we unwind it based on what the actual impacts were on the Canadian economy, on upswings or downturns in actual economic data. So by the time you hit budget, February budget 2014, we have at least 2 quarters of economic data. We have 8 periods of fiscal data, so what the government has actually spent for 8 months of the year. So it's obviously a more robust forecast when we're only a couple months from the finish line.
Okay, thank you. Time has expired. Moving over now to Mr. Allen. You have the floor again, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Matthews, I'm going to take you back to the deck that you provided me, because maybe it's because it's Thursday and where many of us are leaving this evening, it's cloudy today, perhaps, inside one part of my hemisphere. When you talked about restatements, and you're talking about bonds, buyback, and I believe there was one other piece as well, valuation for social housing. And it looks like you took it back over the last 2 years, 2013-14, 2012-13, and restated the position based on how you changed the accounting procedure. I get that piece. So the issue becomes, it looks as if it's somewhere in the neighborhood for 2013-14 of about $7 billion, 5.4 for bonds and 1.6 for social housing. Does that seem about right to you, or 1.6 I think it is?
5.7 for bonds on the accumulated deficit, I think,
and
1.6.
a $0.2 billion decrease. I had to get down to the bottom line. I did dates ahead of myself there,
okay,
which would take it down to, say, 5.2 billion of an increase in the deficit for that particular year. Is that correct?
It depends which year you're looking at. So if you're looking at the 13-14 year, there was an increase in the opening balance of accumulated deficit of 13-14 and a $0.3 billion decrease in the annual deficit of 12-13. So if you're looking for the annual deficit impacts, $0.3 billion in 12-13 for bond buybacks.
Okay.
And then in 12-13, $0.2 billion in the annual deficit of related to the social housing program. The big numbers are on the balance sheets or the statement of financial position. The opening accumulated deficit, that's where you see the larger numbers.
Okay. So the question is sort of, it's like an earworm burning it in there. It is, without the changes, and I'm not questioning the validity of them, in the sense of, did we decide to do this in a certain way? That happens. We saw this before at this committee where accounting practices get changed from one to another. That's just the way it is. What difference does that make to the specific deficits of those 2 years if you hadn't had to make this change? Is that a cumulative piece? In other words, you just simply make a straight subtraction? If you didn't have to have done that, it would be obviously less.
If we didn't do that adjustment, if we had have just decided not to make these changes at all, if that's your question, so we would have had a $0.3 billion decrease in related to the bonds, and then 0.2 related to social housing. So basically, the impact in the 13-14 year, or sorry, in 12-13 years, 0.5.
So $500 million, give or take.
My colleague to my right here might want to explain the impact on 13,
No, it's okay.
14.
That's about the highest level I need it to be.
Okay.
I didn't need any more detail. No offense, Mr. Vaillant. I mean,
I want to get Mr. Vaillant on the record.
I understand you do, sir, but we don't. The guy over here with the gavel doesn't give you a lot of time.
No.
I really didn't need that much detail. I just needed that level to make sure I had it clear in my head. The other piece in the deck, you talked about one-time payments in the revenue stream from the sale of GM stuck in my head.
Yep.
I spent 32 years there, so it kind of sticks to my head. But I don't know if you actually gave us a number of, I recognize you sold some properties overseas. I know the High Commissioner's residence, I believe, in London. I had breakfast there once a couple of years ago, so I guess I'm not having breakfast there again. But is there a number attached to that, sir? Because it is one-time funding.
Yeah, so on the GM front, both are one-time. Well, GM is ongoing. The government ended up with shares.
You get some left.
We're selling those in pieces. The actual gain in the 13-14 year, I will turn to my colleague because he just told me the number.
We got you up to
$679 million.
Thank you.
So, but if I could just to
do it quickly though, because I don't have much time.
All right. If you have more questions, you go ahead.
Okay. So let me take you to my friend Mr. Regan talked about the lapse funding. I got the numbers. I hear your comment too. It was in the newspapers and all that sort of stuff. I'm not going down that road. I want to ask you specifically, and I understand lapse funding is an ex-municipal person who used to work corporate finance and when I was an elected official. I understand you can take funding 5% in the operating sense, 20% in the capital sense. Two questions. One is, when you move the capital, not the operating, I'm not concerned with that. Operating is operating. You may have changes in operating next year, so you just move the money. In the capital sense, does it stay with the same project? One. And secondly, when the lapse funding you looked at, does it concern you as a ballpark number? Or if not, if yes, well, you'll tell us that. And if not, does any one particular department's lapse funding concern you from the sense that it maybe is larger than what it ought to be? I get what you said from the very beginning, Mr. Matthews. When we actually allocate money budget-wise from the government asks, it's an up to. One doesn't spend 105% because you need to come back and see us. And so I'm not arguing whether indeed they did a good job or not a good job. Simply from accounting procedure, for when people are crafting budgets, are they doing a good job is really what I want to know.
So from your first question on the capital, does it stay with the same project, is a fascinating question. From a parliamentary control perspective, Parliament controls on the total vote. So it's just one global number for capital. So you're not approving certain projects. So from a parliamentary control perspective, no. From an operational perspective, departments basically are tracking their projects. They have capital attached to them. If one is, under budget and another is over budget, can they move that money around? Yes, they can. So that's one. The other point in terms of are there any departments whose lapses concern me? No. The interesting thing about government, the lapse is lower this year than the previous year. Typically speaking, when there are cutbacks or reductions in budgets, departments are so worried about overspending, they put the brakes on too hard. So ironically, in years when we're cutting back, lapses are typically higher than in years when we're not. And it's kind of a strange phenomenon, but it speaks to the importance of not overspending your budget. In this fiscal year, when you actually look at the net lapse, the vast majority of it is planned. Capital carry forward, operating carry forward. We didn't talk about grants and contributions. Two major grants and contributions programs really accounted for the bulk of the lapse on that side. Infrastructure, which is complex negotiations, no big surprise. And our friends at Indian Northern Affairs, again, negotiations, difficult stuff, so you often see high lapses there.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, time has expired. And over to Mr. Woodworth, and you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Matthews, I just want to put one last understanding onto what you were just speaking about with Mr. Allen. I'm looking at the chart on page 1.10, which indicates that out of projected program expenses of 251,243 million, there was 2.636 not spent. And this amounts to something like 1% or close to it of the total projected program expenses. So I just want to ask you, am I right, that in fact the difference between projected program expenses and actual program spending was something very close to 1%, and if so, do you consider that a good performance or not?
This is a fascinating question. So my friend Nick is going to have to weigh in here. No, this is great. So when our colleagues at Finance do the budget, they know departments are not going to spend all of the money that Parliament authorizes. So they make their own projection as to what will actually get spent. And so I believe the number you're looking at here in a projection would factor in finances and central agencies' assumptions of spending patterns. When you looked at the lapse that we've been seeing in the papers, that was the comparison against what Parliament authorized. So it was much higher. This 1% here really speaks to Finance's ability to forecast accurately, and they did a pretty good job. So congratulations, Nick. But that's a different number than what we've been talking about with the lapse, because Finance knows that infrastructure money, generally lapses at fairly significant amounts. D&D usually lapses big funding. So that's kind of the trade-off.
Very good.
Did I miss anything, Nick?
I would only add that of that $2.6 billion, it was revision to the Alberta flood liability in the order of about 1.2, right, which actually drove that number as high as it was. So.
Yeah. So it actually makes the planning almost bang on, which I find very impressive. So thank you for that.
On the expense side, yeah, we did well.
On the expense side, yeah. Correct. Now, I want to go back also, Mr. Leswick, to where I left off earlier about revenues and taxes, and I'll start with the chart on page 1.6, which shows an increase in, let's say, income tax revenues, an increase in other taxes and duties, and an increase in total revenues. And so we know that under the current government, taxes have not only been restrained, but in fact have been reduced. So can you shed some light on this for us as to how we can continue to see increasing revenues, even though the Government of Canada has been reducing rates of taxation?
Right, and again, this is links to our discussion earlier in the session, where we continue to garner increased tax revenues because the economy is growing. So while tax rates are going down, the economy is growing, people are consuming more, people are making more money, we collect more taxes, correct, notwithstanding a lower effective tax rate. So it's really just a function of economic growth. And the
GDP growth in the year under examination was 3.4%, if I'm reading things correctly. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about that. Program spending went up only 1%, which was not as great as the 3.4% GDP growth. Would the increased revenue that we're seeing from GDP growth be enough to kill off the deficit if there had not also been restraint in program spending? Did I make that question clear?
I think so. Now, again, our program expenses are a function of the major transfers, so major transfers to provinces, which are effectively tied to nominal GDP growth. Right. So they will pay more as long as the economy is growing more. Likewise, some of the transfers to persons are indexed. Yeah. So there's a certain amount of expenses that are out of our control.
I'm speaking of the program expense line, which I saw somewhere was limited to 1%, and other government expenditures, in fact, were less than, were reduced. So I guess what I'm asking you is whether revenue increase alone would have slain the deficit, or was there also a need for fiscal discipline in restraining spending?
That's good, Bill.
Maybe a couple of thoughts, and Nick can weigh in with the actual detailed numbers. But what I would say, we're not back to surplus yet. They're forecasting a surplus, but for the current year, we posted a deficit, and we haven't actually realized a surplus yet. If you think about the size of the saving measures, we certainly wouldn't be as close to being back in balance without those. So the Strategic and Operating Review, or DRAP, was $5 billion annually on an ongoing basis that was reduced. We had about $700 million related to pension contribution rates that's taking effect. We had operating budget freeze of $550 million. So, and then retiree health care, $7 billion over 6 years. Those are pretty significant numbers. It would take a lot of growth to kind of make those up. And at the same time, we've got some expenses that are growing from a legislative perspective. So the old age benefits, we need to make reductions in some spending to offset the growth in the statutory spending.
Okay, sorry, time has expired. Actually let a little time go by there. Colleagues, that exhausts our usual round of questioning. And so at this time, I will thank our guests for being here. If I might, just one last comment before we close off. Lots of credit to go around for the clean audit. But as the longest-serving member of this committee in Parliament, I've been on this committee now since 2004, we continue to get this issue about national defence, and it's a chronic issue, and it's a lot like health and social services for First Nations people and our other Aboriginal Canadians. It's chronic and just goes on and on and on. It crosses party lines. It is a management issue as much as it's a political issue. It's been over 10 years. That's long enough. There needs to be some resolution. And Mr. Matthews, I understand when you said that the lapsing and there has to, especially with defence because of the big numbers, but we've been through this before many times. The auditors are very much aware that there is that kind of latitude, and yet we continue to get this notice both when we're doing public accounts and on certain chapters. So National Defence needs to know that this committee and the Auditor General's office are going to continue to stay focused on this until they up their game and get where they need to be. We're very, very proud of the things that are good, but we need to stay focused on the things that aren't so that we continue to earn that reputation, and National Defence needs to up their game in this area. It's not good enough. So I hope that gets carried back. With that, I want to thank you all very, very much. Mr. Matthews, I particularly want to thank you. There's a divide there. I mean, the auditor folks are over there, and the folks that are working for the government begin with you and over. And yet, on a question from Mr. Allen, where you thought it might be that he needed to get a question in there, I've seen so many bureaucrats come in and they can play the game, they can run the clock. You actually stopped, paused, and actually said, I think there was maybe another question you wanted. That's appreciated, and notwithstanding that you're here sort of representing the government's interests, I want to tell you that as the chair of this committee, that's exactly the kind of professionalism that, that underscores how proud we are of the work that we do. That was very good, sir, and I hope to see more of that from senior people who come here. Colleagues, with that, this committee meeting now stands adjourned with our thanks to our guests. All in favour of adjournment, please leave.